You're gonna get court-martialed for this." The voice came sharp and furious, cutting through the drone of engines at the 56th Fighter Group's muddy English airfield. Sergeant Joe Hanley didn't even look up from the open cowling of the P-47 Thunderbolt in front of him. His hands were deep inside the machine's guts, wrenching at a stubborn line on the turbo system that had already killed 2 engines that week. The lieutenant stormed closer, boots splashing in puddles of oil and rainwater. "Hanley, I gave you an order. Do not alter the wastegate system. You do, and I'll personally write you up." Hanley's jaw clenched. "Sir, if I don't fix her this way, she'll never fly again." The lieutenant glared at him, rain streaking down his cap. "You think you know better than Republic's engineers?" "No, sir," Hanley said, tightening a final bolt. "I just know what happens when that line sticks. The next time a pilot hits the boost, he'll cook the engine before he hits 3,000 feet. And I'm tired of scraping them out of the sky." The officer hesitated, his anger dimming just slightly under Hanley's calm defiance. "You're taking this on yourself?" Hanley stood, wiping grease across his sleeve. "Always have, sir." The P-47, tail number 42-26415, sat half disassembled behind them, a hulking, oil-smeared beast that most of the men had given up on. Its left wing was patched with aluminum panels from 3 other wrecks. Its engine block had been rebuilt twice. The men called it Lucky 13, half in mockery, half in hope. For weeks, the squadron had been losing pilots to the same problem: boost lag from the turbocharger system. At high altitudes, the plane could outrun almost anything. But down low, where dogfights happened, it was sluggish, slow to climb, too heavy to dance with the nimble Focke-Wulfs. Hanley had watched one of those Thunderbolts go down just 3 days earlier. Lieutenant Cooper, 23 years old, his second mission. His radio had screamed, "No power! No power!" before the static drowned him out. Hanley had found pieces of the wreckage in a field the next morning. That's when he'd decided, if the manuals couldn't fix it, he would, even if it meant breaking every regulation in the book. All through that night, while the others slept, Hanley worked in the hangar with a single lamp burning low. He rerouted part of the wastegate, installed a bypass valve from a salvaged Allison engine, and modified the throttle response so the turbo would kick in earlier. It was dangerous. If the airflow was off by a fraction, the engine could blow apart on takeoff. But Hanley trusted his gut more than any manual. He'd been fixing machines since he was 12, and machines, he believed, were like people. They needed to breathe right. By dawn, the modified engine growled to life. The roar was deeper, meaner, like the aircraft had been reborn. Pilots came running from the barracks. One of them whistled. "What the hell did you feed her, Hanley?" He just grinned. "A little oxygen and a bad attitude." That afternoon, despite the lieutenant's warnings, he took the P-47 out himself. He wasn't supposed to fly. Mechanics weren't cleared for test runs. But rules had never stopped him before. The plane lifted off the runway with a ferocity that shocked even him. The gauges spiked. The climb rate doubled. The airframe shook with raw power, but it held. He pushed the throttle wide open and screamed across the English countryside, laughing into the wind. When he landed, the crew stared in silence. Hanley climbed out, heart hammering, and said the only words that came to him, "She's fixed." The lieutenant just shook his head. "No, Hanley. You just started a war with the manual." A week later, Lucky 13 flew into combat over France. It came back covered in bullet holes, oil dripping, the paint scorched. But it came back. The pilot stumbled out, pale and trembling. "Whatever you did, Hanley," he said, "that thing just outran a 190. Hanley looked past him at the battered plane, still smoking but alive. "Then I guess," he muttered, "it was worth breaking the law." By the spring of 1943, the American air war over Europe had turned into a brutal test of endurance. The Luftwaffe still owned the skies. The B-17 and B-24 bombers that thundered across the Channel were falling in terrifying numbers, torn apart by Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s. The U.S. Army Air Forces had pinned their hopes on a new escort fighter, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. On paper, it was unbeatable. In practice, it was a disappointment. The Thunderbolt was massive, nearly twice the weight of a German fighter. Pilots loved its ruggedness, but cursed its sluggish climb rate. The powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine gave it speed at high altitude, but down low, where most fights started, the turbocharger lagged just long enough to get men killed. They called it the Jug for its shape and weight. Some called it worse things: the Flying Anvil, the Widowmaker, and the Beast that hated to climb. At the 56th Fighter Group's muddy airfield in Boxted, England, maintenance crews worked in exhaustion and frustration. Engines overheated, boost controls failed, oil pressure dropped mid-flight. Ground crews cannibalized wrecked planes for spare parts, welding together thunderbolts from the bones of others. Hanley, now 26 and covered in the black grime of his trade, had become known for one thing: the man who could make the impossible fly again. He had grown up in a tiny Ohio town, fixing tractors and old Fords before the war. He was the kind of man who listened to machines like they were living things. The pilots respected him because when Hanley said a plane was ready, it meant something. But lately, even he was losing faith. He'd seen too many good men fall from the sky because of the same cursed problem: turbo lag and power loss under stress. One afternoon, he stood beside Captain Red Mason, a fiery-haired pilot from Kentucky, watching a recovery team haul back another wreck. The Thunderbolt had lost power mid-dive. The engine had locked. The pilot had bailed too late. Mason spat into the mud. "We can't keep doing this, Joe. She's a tank, not a fighter." Hanley stared at the twisted remains. A tank can still move if you feed it right. The two men had argued with higher-ups for weeks, demanding permission to tweak the turbocharger system. The answer was always the same: unauthorized modifications to the R2800 are strictly prohibited. The engineers at Republic Aviation were proud of their design. Too proud. The mechanics were told to follow the manuals, not their instincts. But Hanley couldn't watch another pilot die because someone sitting behind a desk thought a piece of paper knew better than the men on the ground. That night, Hanley sat in the dim barracks, flipping through the maintenance manual again. He knew every line by heart, and he knew where the flaw was. The turbocharger's wastegate system bled too much pressure during rapid throttle changes. The airflow lagged behind the engine's needs, starving it just long enough to stall the climb. He sketched out a new route in his notebook, a modified linkage that would shorten the delay and increase response. It was simple. It was brilliant. And it was absolutely illegal. When he showed the drawing to another mechanic, Corporal Donnelly, the younger man shook his head. "They'll throw you in Leavenworth, Joe." Hanley smirked. "Not if it works." The rain hammered the tin roof above them. In the distance, engines rumbled. Another dawn, another sortie. Hanley closed his notebook and tucked it under his cot. "If they're going to fight for their lives," he said quietly, "the least I can do is give them a fighting chance." It wasn't heroism. It wasn't rebellion. It was frustration turned into defiance. The kind only a mechanic who'd seen too much death could understand. By the end of that week, Sergeant Joe Hanley's frustration had hardened into quiet rebellion. The Thunderbolts were still flying, still losing engines, still falling out of the sky over France. The official reports blamed enemy fire or pilot error. Hanley knew better. The fault was mechanical, predictable, preventable, and fixable. If only someone would let him try. On the night of May 19th, 1943, when the hangar was finally empty and the rain had turned the airfield into a swamp of mud and oil, Hanley stayed behind. He closed the steel doors, hung a single lamp from the rafters, and rolled up his sleeves. His subject sat in the corner, a damaged P-47 that had been written off for parts. He'd already scrounged everything he needed: copper tubing from a wrecked B-24, a handful of pressure valves, and a piece of reinforced ducting from an old Allison V1710 engine. He began by removing the stock wastegate actuator. His plan was simple but daring. Shorten the response delay by rerouting the control line directly into the manifold rather than through the throttle regulator. It would allow faster boost engagement, eliminating that deadly pause between throttle advance and engine power. The risk was enormous, but too much pressure and the engine would blow apart. Too little, and it would stall. As Hanley worked, his grease-stained hands moved with the precision of a surgeon. He didn't look like a rebel. He looked like a man in prayer. Each turn of the wrench was a calculated act of defiance against bureaucracy and blind procedure. "You're not a machine," he muttered to the Thunderbolt. "You're a beast. You just need to breathe." At midnight, Corporal Donnelly crept into the hangar, flashlight flickering. "Joe, for God's sake, the MPs are doing rounds. If they find you—" Hanley didn't look up. "They won't. This is madness. You can't just rebuild the Army's most expensive engine by guesswork." Hanley smiled faintly. "Guesswork? No. I've listened to these birds scream and die for 6 months. I know their last words better than my own." The younger man hesitated, torn between fear and admiration. "You'll get hanged for this." Hanley finally looked up, eyes cold and steady. "If it saves even one of those kids out there, they can hang me twice." By dawn, the job was done. The modified turbocharger gleamed under the light, its lines tight and purposeful. Hanley wiped his hands on his coveralls and stood back, exhausted but alive in a way he hadn't felt for months. He decided to test it himself. Mechanics weren't supposed to fly, but he wasn't about to hand his work to a pilot unproven. He taxied the Thunderbolt, now nicknamed Lucky 13, to the far edge of the field, ignoring the shouting from the control shack. The propeller roared to life, coughing smoke and flame, then settled into a deep, smooth hum. Hanley throttled forward. The plane leapt off the ground like a thing possessed. The boost gauge climbed instantly, faster than he'd ever seen. The aircraft surged upward, punching through the morning fog with raw, furious energy. At 3,000 feet, the engine still held steady, purring like a predator. Hanley shouted into the wind, half laughing, half crying, "She's alive!" When he landed, the MPs were waiting. His commanding officer stormed across the tarmac, face red. "Hanley, you broke half the maintenance code of the U.S. Army Air Forces. You'll be lucky if you don't spend the rest of the war peeling potatoes in Kansas." Hanley climbed down slowly, oil streaking his face, eyes wild with adrenaline. "Maybe so, sir, but that plane can fight now." The officer glared at him, then turned to look at Lucky 13, still ticking hot under the morning sun. Something in his expression softened. Not approval, not forgiveness, but the faintest trace of respect. Hanley saluted, grease-stained and defiant. "Permission to fix the rest, sir?" 2 days later, Hanley's illegal modification faced its trial by fire. The 56th Fighter Group was ordered to provide escort for a formation of B-17s heading deep into occupied France. The Luftwaffe had been hitting them hard, Focke-Wulf 190s screaming in at low altitude, cutting through the bomber boxes like wolves among sheep. The P-47s had to keep up, but the problem was always the same. When the dogfights dropped below 10,000 feet, the turbo lag made them slow, sitting ducks. Captain Red Mason volunteered to take Lucky 13 up. He had been one of Hanley's most vocal critics, the kind of pilot who followed the manual by the word. But after seeing what the Thunderbolt had done during Hanley's unauthorized test, even he was curious. "You sure this monster won't blow up on me, Joe?" Mason asked with a half grin, strapping into the cockpit. Hanley smirked, patting the cowling like it was a living thing. "Only if you treat her gentle. She likes to be angry." The engines of the squadron thundered to life, shaking the ground. The line of Thunderbolts began to roll down the slick runway, each trailing black exhaust into the gray morning sky. Hanley stood on the flight line, eyes fixed on Lucky 13 as it climbed higher and higher, faster than he'd ever seen one of his planes go. Hours later, as the mission reached the target zone near Rouen, the Luftwaffe struck. German fighters appeared out of the clouds, their cannon fire slicing through the bomber formation. Mason's radio crackled with shouts and static. "Eagle 1 to base, we're engaged. 30+ bandits." Hanley and the ground crew listened over the field radio. The chatter was chaos, calls for help, bursts of gunfire, engines screaming through the clouds. Then Mason's voice cut through, sharp and breathless. "She's holding, Joe, she's holding. I'm climbing past him." Up there, Mason felt the P-47 respond like never before. When he pushed the throttle, the boost came instantly. The roar of the engine deepened, and the heavy aircraft leapt ahead like a hawk diving on prey. A German FW-190 flashed past his nose, firing. Mason rolled hard, pulled up, and hit the boost again. The P-47 climbed in seconds. The 190 tried to follow, but stalled out, coughing black smoke. Mason swung around and fired a 2-second burst. 650 caliber Brownings opened fire, stitching fire across the German fighter's fuselage. The plane exploded in mid-air, fragments tumbling through the clouds. Back at base, Hanley and the others crowded around the radio. Mason's voice came again, hoarse but triumphant. "Tell that mechanic of yours he just built me a damn miracle." When Lucky 13 returned, the squadron erupted. The plane's wings were riddled with bullet holes, one tire shredded, the fuselage dented. But the engine still roared. Hanley climbed onto the wing as Mason pulled off his oxygen mask, sweat streaming down his face. "You crazy bastard," Mason said, grinning. "She doesn't just fly, she hunts." That night, the officers gathered in the mess tent, whispering over coffee and cigarettes. Someone called it a fluke. Another called it luck. But one of the older captains simply said, "You don't argue with results." Hanley sat outside, smoking quietly, listening to the engines cool. He didn't care about medals or promotions. All he cared about was the silence. No missing planes, no funerals that day. Just the sound of rain and metal settling in the dark. He'd broken the rules. But for the first time in months, the airfield didn't smell like failure. It smelled like victory. The celebration lasted less than 48 hours before the paperwork caught up. The U.S. Army Air Forces did not tolerate unsanctioned modifications, especially on multi-million-dollar aircraft. When the Inspector General's jeep rolled up to the 56th Fighter Group's airfield, the laughter in the mess tent died instantly. Two officers in clean uniforms stepped out, carrying folders stamped "Confidential." Sergeant Hanley was summoned to the command post. Inside, the air reeked of coffee and cigarette smoke. The squadron commander, Colonel Wallace, sat behind his desk, stiff-backed and silent. Across from him stood Major Tillman, an engineering officer from 8th Air Force Headquarters. The man's face was stone. "Sergeant Hanley," Tillman began, "you've been accused of unauthorized modification to government property, disobeying direct orders, and endangering operational aircraft." Hanley stood at attention, his knuckles white. "Yes, sir." Tillman flipped through a report. "It says here you altered the turbocharger wastegate control on a P-47 under your maintenance care. That true?" "Yes, sir." "And that aircraft was flown in combat without clearance from Base Engineering Command?" "Yes, sir." Tillman closed the folder and stared at him. "You realize what that means? You're facing court-martial." Hanley nodded once. "Yes, sir. But before you do that, ask Captain Mason what happened when he flew it." The major frowned, glancing at Wallace. "We've already read his report. 1 enemy kill, aircraft returned with battle damage, no mechanical failure." Hanley's voice was calm but firm. "Then you know it worked." Tillman exhaled through his nose. "Sergeant, that's not the point. We can't have mechanics deciding when to rewrite the damn rule book. If every man in the service thought like you, we'd have chaos." Hanley looked the major straight in the eye. "With respect, sir, chaos is what happens when you bury men because you were too afraid to try something that worked." The room went silent. Colonel Wallace leaned back in his chair, watching them both. There was something dangerous in Hanley's tone. Not insubordination, but conviction. The kind that made regulations tremble. Finally, Wallace spoke. "Major, let me speak plainly. You know the losses we've taken. Every fix from Republic takes weeks. Every part shortage costs lives. Maybe this kid did something stupid, but he got results. If we court-martial him, we might as well hang half the mechanics in the 8th. Tillman rubbed his temples, clearly torn. "You can't just ignore the chain of command." "No," Wallace said quietly. "But sometimes you bend it to save it." The next day, the investigation team spent hours examining Lucky 13. They took photographs, ran diagnostics, measured airflow, and cross-checked boost ratios. When the results came back, even the engineers couldn't deny it. Hanley's modification had improved throttle response by nearly 40%, with no mechanical failures. It was the kind of performance boost that could save lives and change the air war. That evening, Tillman approached Hanley outside the hangar. The mechanic was sitting on a crate rolling a cigarette. The major handed him a paper. "This isn't a commendation," he said. "It's a non-punitive letter of record. You're not being charged, but don't mistake that for permission." Hanley looked up. "Does that mean I stop fixing them?" Tillman hesitated, then gave a faint smile. "It means if you're going to keep breaking the rules, make damn sure the results are worth it." When the major walked away, Hanley lit his cigarette and looked back at Lucky 13. The engine still gleamed from the day's inspection, its modified tubing catching the last orange light of dusk. He took a long drag and muttered, "Worth it's all I've ever had." The next morning, a quiet memo arrived from headquarters. Effective immediately, Republic Aviation would review the turbocharger system on all new production Thunderbolts, using field modifications observed from active units. Hanley didn't need a translator. His illegal fix was about to become official doctrine. Within a month, whispers of Hanley's illegal fix spread across England. Mechanics in other P-47 groups began quietly replicating his modification, passing notes and sketches like contraband. It was a grassroots revolution under the radar of command, a silent network of grease-stained engineers and mechanics who cared less about orders and more about keeping their pilots alive. By July 1943, Thunderbolt squadrons from the 56th to the 78th began reporting something remarkable: fewer engine stalls, faster climbs, quicker boosts in low-altitude combat. Word reached pilots first. They started calling it the Hanley mod, half in jest, half in reverence. Nobody cared that it wasn't in the manual anymore. The results spoke louder than rank. For the first time, the P-47 Thunderbolt was fighting on its own terms. No longer sluggish or slow to climb, it became a true predator. German pilots who once dove in confidence now found the heavy American fighter right on their tails. In combat reports, Luftwaffe officers began referring to the new Thunderbolt as der Teufelsschlitten, the Devil's Sled. One of the first to notice was Colonel Hubert Zemke, the legendary commander of the 56th Fighter Group. He was a pilot's pilot, brilliant, fearless, and famously intolerant of bureaucratic nonsense. When he learned about the unofficial modifications spreading through his squadrons, he didn't reprimand anyone. Instead, he called Hanley into his office. "I've read your report," Zemke said, his voice steady. "You broke regulations, you risked your career, and you saved lives." He paused, studying Hanley's grease-streaked uniform. "You ever think of applying for an engineering commission?" Hanley chuckled. "No, sir. I'm better with a wrench than a pen." Zemke nodded. "Then keep that wrench ready. The war's not over, and I've got a few more devils for you to tame." As the summer turned to autumn, the improved Thunderbolts began turning the tide of the air war. The 56th became the highest-scoring fighter group in the European theater. Their kill ratios skyrocketed. Pilots who once dreaded takeoff now joked that flying a jug with the Hanley mod was like riding a charging bull with wings. Even in the Luftwaffe, rumors spread. Downed German pilots reported over debriefings that the Thunderbolts were suddenly faster in climbs, nearly impossible to shake. One ace was quoted saying, "The fat American plane no longer wallows. It pounces." But the success came at a price. The more the modification spread, the more the Army Air Force's brass wanted answers. Officially, there was no Hanley fix. Yet every time a squadron requested parts or performance logs, the pattern was clear. Someone had rewritten the rules of aerial combat with nothing but scrap metal and intuition. Late one night, Hanley received a letter. It wasn't from command. It was from a pilot named Mason, now stationed in France. Inside was a photo of Lucky 13, riddled with new battle scars, parked beside a line of smoking Luftwaffe wrecks. Scrawled across the back was a simple note. "Still breathing, still hunting. You did that." Hanley kept that photo in his pocket from that night forward. To him, it wasn't about recognition. It was proof that one act of disobedience done for the right reason could ripple across an entire war. When he walked the flight line the next morning, he noticed something strange. Every Thunderbolt parked in the mist had the same tiny copper reroute visible under the cowling, the unmistakable mark of his creation. Dozens of planes gleaming like steel bulls ready for war. Hanley grinned to himself. The rule book had lost. The war had gained something far greater. An army of men who believed in fixing what others called impossible. The proof of Hanley's rebellion came not in reports or memos, but in one terrible, glorious day of combat, September 6, 1943. The mission? Escort a massive formation of B-17 flying fortresses to strike Stuttgart. Nearly 400 bombers, 200 fighters, and an ocean of steel against the heart of Germany's industry. Hanley stood on the tarmac that morning, hands trembling as he watched Lucky 13 roar to life. The entire squadron was airborne within minutes. He could feel it, the tension that always came before bad weather or worse news. And he was right. 2 hours into the flight, the Luftwaffe came for them. It wasn't a skirmish, it was an ambush. Hundreds of F-190s and Me-109s diving from the sun in perfect formation. The sky erupted. From the ground station, Hanley listened as the radio turned to chaos. Pilots shouting bearings, calling for help, yelling, praying, engines screaming as they took hits, and through it all, Mason's voice. Calm, measured. "They're coming in low, punching through the bombers. We've got to cut them off. Hanley's mod better hold." Up there, Mason's Thunderbolt climbed hard, boosted faster than anything else in the fight. The modified turbo kicked in instantly, launching him upward into the path of the attacking Germans. The first Focke-Wulf that crossed his sights didn't stand a chance. Mason squeezed the trigger. 850 calibers thundered, their tracers glowing orange against the pale morning sky. The German plane disintegrated in flame. Below, the bombers began to stabilize. They had cover now, real cover. Dozens of Thunderbolts roared through the formation, their engines screaming with that distinct deeper tone that only the Hanley mod could produce. In 10 minutes, the Luftwaffe's advantage was gone. The German pilots had expected slow, heavy escorts. Instead, they found monsters, fast, relentless, impossible to shake. One Luftwaffe ace would later recall, "The P-47s did not fight like before. They climbed like devils. We could not understand it." Mason scored 2 more kills before his left wing took a burst of cannon fire. The Thunderbolt bucked violently, oil spraying across the canopy. But the engine, Hanley's engine, held. Mason limped back across the channel, half-conscious, blood running down his face. When his wheels finally hit the English mud, he blacked out. Hanley was there when they dragged Mason from the cockpit. His hands were burned from the control stick, his flight jacket torn and soaked in oil. As medics carried him away, he grabbed Hanley's sleeve and whispered, She didn't die, Joe. Not even when I did everything wrong. She just kept flying. For Hanley, that moment was worth every threat, every reprimand, every sleepless night spent defying orders. He walked to Lucky 13, still ticking hot, its cowling streaked with carbon and blood, and placed his hand on the nose. "You're a killer now," he said quietly. The after-action report stunned everyone. The 56th Fighter Group had destroyed more than 50 enemy aircraft for the loss of only 4 Thunderbolts. It was the single most lopsided engagement of the war for the unit. Headquarters called it superior flying. Pilots called it finally having a plane that fights back. But among the mechanics, the truth was whispered differently. They called it Hanley's War. That night, under the flicker of hangar lamps, Hanley and his crew worked silently, repairing bullet holes and cracked cowlings. Nobody talked about court-martials anymore. Nobody talked about orders. They talked about how to make the next one faster, tougher, better. The air outside still smelled of smoke and cordite, but for the first time, victory felt mechanical, something that could be built, fixed, and flown by hand. The Stuttgart raid changed everything. Headquarters could no longer pretend that the field modifications were an isolated case. Performance data showed it clearly. Thunderbolts with the Hanley mod were outperforming standard factory models in almost every metric. Higher climb rates, faster acceleration, more kills, fewer engine failures. A month later, Hanley received a summons stamped urgent. He was to report to 8th Air Force Engineering Command at Duxford for formal review. The letter was polite, but every man in the hangar read it for what it was: a reckoning. When he arrived, the room was filled with officers, engineers, and factory representatives from Republic Aviation. Charts lined the walls. Photographs of modified aircraft covered the table. At the center sat General Orville Anderson, a stern man known for his absolute adherence to order. He gestured for Hanley to sit. "Sergeant," Anderson began, "we've studied your work. Your modifications have altered the operational profile of the P-47. You understand this is unauthorized?" "Yes, sir," Hanley said. "And yet," Anderson continued, "your modification has saved lives, improved combat performance, and directly influenced ongoing production changes." Hanley hesitated. "I didn't do it for a record, sir. I did it because pilots were dying." Anderson leaned back, his hands clasped. "That's exactly the problem. A soldier doesn't choose when to rewrite the book. That's how wars turn chaotic." Hanley took a breath. "With respect, General, wars are already chaos. We just make sure the chaos runs in our favor." The room fell silent. One of the Republic engineers, a bespectacled man with oil-stained cuffs, smiled faintly. "General, with your permission, I'd like to show you something." He flipped on a projector. The screen displayed test results comparing a stock P-47 to one fitted with Hanley's rerouted turbocharger lines. The data was undeniable. The mod-cut response lagged by half. Anderson's face softened ever so slightly. "You realize," he said, "you've forced the entire chain of command to admit that initiative might be worth more than obedience." Hanley didn't answer. The meeting ended without applause, without reprimand. But when Hanley left the building, the same engineer caught up to him outside. "You'll never hear it officially," he said, "but Republic is redesigning the next production block to include your fix. They're calling it the responsive throttle system. It's your design, Sergeant." Hanley blinked, unsure whether to laugh or curse. "So it's official now?" The engineer grinned. "Official enough to win a war." When Hanley returned to base, the tone had changed. No one called him reckless anymore. Pilots bought him drinks. Crew chiefs asked for blueprints. And the same officers who once threatened him with court-martial now asked his opinion on cooling efficiency and manifold pressure. But for Hanley, the glory meant little. He knew the true price. Every improvement was written in oil, sweat, and blood. He'd seen men die waiting for rules to catch up with reality. Late that night, sitting in the empty hangar, he heard Mason's plane taxi in from another mission. The Thunderbolt was battered, one wing patched with sheet metal. Mason limped out of the cockpit, grinning through exhaustion. "She's still flying, Joe," he said. "That's 3 runs this week. You sure you didn't make a deal with the devil?" Hanley smirked. "Nah, just with the machine." He looked at Lucky 13, now sporting the latest upgrades. His upgrades. The engine still purred like it had something to prove. For the first time, Hanley allowed himself a small, quiet smile. The war wasn't over. But thanks to one illegal fix, America's Thunderbolts were flying higher, faster, and deadlier than ever before. Sometimes the difference between a hero and a criminal was just whether the damn thing worked. By the spring of 1944, the war in the air had changed. The Luftwaffe was bleeding, its aces exhausted, its fuel lines strangled. But in England, the sky still thundered every morning with the sound of P-47s taking off in endless formation. Hanley's modification, now officially adopted, was standard issue on new models. What began as an illegal fix had become part of the war machine. On May 8th, Hanley received word that Mason was leading another deep escort into Germany. The mission? Protect a bomber wing heading for Mersburg, home of the synthetic fuel refineries that kept the German war effort alive. It was one of the most dangerous assignments yet. Hanley knew it, and so did Mason. Before takeoff, Mason found him by the hangar, a coffee tin in one hand, helmet in the other. "You know, Joe," he said, "if we make it through this, I'm buying you a beer so big you'll drown in it." Hanley smiled. "Just bring the plane back, that'll be enough." The roar of engines filled the air as the Thunderbolts took off in waves, their silver bodies glinting under the dawn. Hanley stood watching, shielding his eyes from the glare, as Lucky 13 climbed into the morning clouds. Hours later, the radio at the control post began to crackle. Static, voices, then chaos. "Bandits, 2 o'clock. Messerschmitt's diving, 20 plus." Another voice cut through the noise. "Masons. I've got 'em in sight. They're going for the bombers, cutting across to intercept." The next minutes felt endless. Hanley gripped the radio desk so hard his knuckles went white. Reports flooded in. "Thunderbolt down. B-17 hit. We're losing altitude." And then, silence. 5 minutes later, Mason's voice came back, ragged, panting, but alive. "Tell Joe. Tell him she's still flying." Hanley felt something crack inside him. Relief, pride, fear, all tangled together. The battle raged for another hour before the remaining planes limped home. When Lucky 13 finally landed, its fuselage looked like it had flown through hell. Bullet holes riddled the cowling, one landing gear half collapsed. But Mason stepped down, alive. Hanley met him halfway. Both men too exhausted to speak. Mason held up his helmet, a jagged hole punched clean through the top. "You think she'll hold together one more run?" Hanley looked at the battered machine, the smell of oil and metal thick in the air. "If she's got one more breath left, she'll fly it for you." In the weeks that followed, news spread fast. The raid on Mersburg had been a success. The synthetic fuel facilities were destroyed, crippling the German war effort. Analysts would later say it was one of the pivotal strikes that brought the Luftwaffe to its knees. But for Hanley, the numbers didn't matter. He saw the cost etched on the faces of pilots, the dents in the planes, the oil-stained ground. War wasn't won by perfection. It was won by men willing to bend the rules just enough to make the impossible work. That night, Mason joined Hanley outside the hangar. The sun was setting over the airfield, the sky a deep red that made the rows of planes look almost holy. Mason handed Hanley a cigarette. "They're saying the new P-47 D-25 has your mod built in, straight from the factory." Hanley exhaled slowly. Then maybe they'll stop calling it illegal. Mason grinned. Nah, that's what made it work. As darkness settled, the two men stood in silence, watching the sky fade from gold to black. In that quiet moment, Hanley realized something simple but profound. The war had been built on thousands of small rebellions like his, acts of defiance that refused to let failure be final. And for every rule that had been broken, one more life had been saved. By the summer of 1945, the roar of engines that had once shaken the English countryside began to fade. Victory in Europe was official. The hangars that had never slept for 3 years finally fell silent, and the men who'd kept them running scattered back to the lives they'd left behind. But for Sergeant Joseph Hanley, there was no easy return. He stood one last time beside Lucky 13. Her paint faded, her nose art-chipped by shrapnel and time. The aircraft was scheduled to be scrapped, melted down like thousands of others. To most, it was just another machine. To Hanley, it was a living memory of rebellion, blood, and faith in something larger than orders. An officer approached with a clipboard. "You, Hanley?" "Yes, sir." "Headquarters wants you in London. Something about a commendation." Hanley almost laughed. A commendation for breaking rules that could have gotten him court-martialed a year earlier. He nodded anyway. When he arrived in London, the ceremony was small. A few officers, a few factory engineers, and a general who looked more tired than proud. The general read from a piece of paper. "For exceptional innovation under combat conditions, contributing directly to the air superiority of Allied forces in the European theater." Hanley barely heard the rest. His mind drifted back to the hangar, the sound of wrenches, the smell of oil, the men who'd believed in him when no one else would. Afterward, as he was leaving, a young lieutenant caught up to him. "Sergeant Hanley," the man said, "you don't know me, but my brother flew with the 56th. He told me you saved more pilots than any general ever did." Hanley smiled faintly. "I didn't save anyone. I just fixed things." The lieutenant shook his head. Sir. That's exactly what saving looks like." When the war ended completely, Hanley went home to Ohio. He got a job in a small auto garage, tuning engines that felt too simple after years of P-47s. Sometimes kids from the neighborhood would come by just to hear his stories. He rarely told the truth, that his best work had been illegal, that the modification that made history was born in secret, under the hum of a single bare bulb. Instead, he'd tell them, "Every machine's got a heartbeat. You just have to listen close enough to hear when it wants to live." In 1950, an Air Force historian tracked him down for an interview. "Sergeant," the man said, "do you realize your modification became standard across all late-war Thunderbolts? It's credited with saving hundreds of aircraft and crews." Hanley only shrugged. "Then I guess the rules were wrong." The historian asked one last question. "If you had it to do again, would you break orders?" Hanley looked at him, the corner of his mouth curling into that same half-smile Mason used to wear. "Son, when the difference between life and death is a half-second of throttle lag, yeah, I'd break them twice." Years later, Lucky 13's name appeared on a roster of surviving Thunderbolts scheduled for restoration. Hanley, old and gray, made one final visit to see it. The mechanic running the restoration shook his hand. "You're the guy who made her a legend," he said. Hanley just smiled. "No, she made herself one. I just gave her permission." As he walked away, the sound of a radial engine starting up in the distance made him pause. That deep, throaty growl, the sound that had once terrified Germany and comforted America. It still echoed like a heartbeat across time. And though the war had long ended, one truth remained as bright as ever. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from those who follow every rule, but from those who love something enough to break them.